Karen Thon Delician is the heir to a legendary name. When he was a young boy, his grandfather swooped down from the stars and rescued him from the slums of his homeworld. But with the death of the infamous old steam surfer, Karen and his crew have fallen on hard times, exiled from the Starfarers Guild and forced to take on risky contracts in the shadowy margins of the stellar tributary. Hello and welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host Liam, aka Hembar, and today I'll be doing a spoiler-free review of Alec Hutson's The Shadows of Dust. The Shadows of Dust is a 2021 standalone science fantasy novel by Alec Hutson. It's a story about Karen, who is bonded with Drifter, which is a gargantuan-sized space creature called a star beast that takes him and his crew across the universe, from planet to planet and into more interesting places. They do this by following space waterways called tributaries, though I guess water is probably not the right word here. At some point recently in the past, the group has left the Starfarers Guild, though whether this was voluntary or not is unknown at the beginning. They are transporting a gobber, a less than upstanding race by general accounts, and a mysterious girl who has supposed map to an unplundered Alvaran treehold. The story is again standalone, and it doesn't waste its time in setting up much of the world. It gets right to the meat of the story. Maybe the first couple paragraphs will be disorienting, but I think it's otherwise pretty easy to follow. The other members of the crew are Nala, a Karathi mage, basically a cat girl, like a bipedal cat girl. Yeah, that's about it actually, besides Drifter, who does have some personality as well, even though he's a giant space turtle. There are eldritch beings in this, in the sense they're kind of Lovecraftian. It would have been disappointing to not have them, I felt like, especially with how the story is set up at the beginning. There are also artifacts of immense power that are slowly coming to being understood throughout the story. There is air in space in this world. If you hadn't noticed, they are traveling through space. It somewhat reminded me of Spelljammer. I'm pretty sure that's where the idea came from. Overall, this is kind of like that, right? Because it's basically D&D in space. There's liches. In some ways, it felt a little bit too much like D&D in space. It does kind of give you a Sword and Planet feel as well. It kind of embraces parts of sci-fi that many writers and readers of today would like to get ever happen for some reason. Before the Golden Age. And speaking of pulp, it's more than being D&D fantasy or cosmic horror, which is not really horror at all. The story is kind of just a Western set in space. And that's basically the book. But I want to say it didn't really keep my attention as much as I would have liked. I think that has to do with Karen. He's rather bland as a character. I didn't connect with him all that much. And some things, like him being one of the most best swordsmen, for example, even to a legendary status, is told to us halfway through the book, and you don't see it at all beforehand. I think the book could be slimmed down some and still be complete. So overall, it was okay, and a nice take on Spelljammer. I have read one Spelljammer novel, so I'm probably more familiar than a lot of people who read this book, but at the same time, this is an adventure that is nothing like that Spelljammer novel. And while it starts off really promising, it's just a little too slow, and I think there's a tendency to have that in, fantasy books these days. And that is something I will always critique, I think. So, there's other things, right, in here that are like, in some ways generic but cool. Besides liches, the Alvarans are basically elves, right? There's space elves. So it's fine. It's a fine book. I think some people would actually probably find it pretty enjoyable as it's slower paced in some ways. But I think once it slows its pace down is actually where it suffers for me. But it's still pretty unique, and so I appreciate Hutson for going out and doing something that not a lot of people do or are doing these days. I think take away maybe some of that D&D influence, and I think it'd be even better. Make it maybe more Sword and Planet-y. So anyways, that's just my thoughts though. And I know this is a standalone technically, but I think Hutson has expressed interest in maybe revisiting the characters. But Liam's Lyceum, I'll catch you next time.